Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Affinity's second evening webinar series program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which Affinity's city office exists. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and to their emerging leaders. And we also honour all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. Tonight's webinar is a special program organised by Affinity and the Human Rights Watch Australia group. My name is Stanks. I'm the Treasurer of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, as well as a member of the Affinity Advisory Board. For those of you who've never attended an Affinity event before, let me briefly introduce you to the organisation. Affinity was formed by a group of young Muslim Australians in 2000. Their aim is to promote multiculturalism and foster intercultural faith and intercultural and interfaith dialogue by building bridges between different groups in society. Unfortunately, due to the tragic times we're facing globally, due to the impact of COVID-19, Affinity has decided to continue their programs through an online platform. The first of these programs began in Ramadan a month ago, in which they arranged 27 daily episodes of Ramadan Conversations with facilitator, former ABC veteran broadcaster John Cleary and George Donican, as well as many other distinguished co-hosts, guests and musicians, joining both nationally and internationally. Let's take a look at a short highlight video summarising these wonderful conversations.
Hello there, and welcome to Ramadan Conversations. We're all in this together.
Yes, fasting is a month of sharing, not just for Muslims as well as non-Muslims.
It's a very big question.
Based information.
And Affinity was extremely good group because it was focusing not on the religious differences, but at what is uniting us.
We're all living.
How do we thrive within this COVID-19 environment?
It's a community mission and everyone has a role to play.
We'll be much happier.
Big cracks that are...
Can I pay tribute to Affinity Intercultural Foundation for your work throughout the community?
I think after a week of my cooking and my wife's cooking, my kids are looking forward to their grandma's cooking.
I'm really proud to say that on the whole, I think as Australians, we've kept our values intact.
And disinformation.
There is a very important correlation between controlling media and the quality of democracy.
Fake journalism.
It didn't become ugly. We held together. And Affinity is part of that spirit and part of that success.
As bystanders,
I'm always inspired by the efforts of Affinity, not just around Ramadan, but certainly then, their dinners, their iftars.
That they desire and be part of all of that is to go for it.
Have met with
Of COVID-19.
I want to thank the Muslim community right across Australia for everything you have been doing and the great example you have been setting and the leadership provided in your community.
As is possible.
Make or break year.
Balancing act.
The duty to reflect on the universe and as a book to read.
Cultural competency.
Affinity is part of the furniture now, as far as Australian multiculturalism is concerned.
What's important, but also how we're going to meet future challenges.
Is somewhat different.
Potential for a blessing.
And surely that's a Muslim and a Christian and a Judaic value. A value of collectivity.
The Nobel Peace Prize.
Is that when we work to complement one another, not the fact that one is better or should be ahead of the other.
More tenuous.
Through meaningful engagement. This very program is just one example.
To weather the storm.
This kind of thing.
1,000 meals a day.
I can't stress how important iftar dinners and sharing and understanding of Islam has been.
Go Cats!
Follow him for the day.
The symptoms of it.
The fake news
have been established saying that religiosity can help people to overcome challenges.
Being Australian, there's a lot of good in there.
We work for each other and work with each other.
Muslim fans.
COVID-19 has stressed the need for people to understand each other and to come together.
How do you think?
Privacy issues.
To use music. And we would like to give a Roman taste to dialogue and mutual understanding.
Import of the interfaith dialogue in Rome and in Italy at the moment.
Prayer is the joining in cosmic worship.
But that is the one thing that I have missed.
Subhanallah, Subhanallah.
The night of revelation, it is both a Jewish and Muslim practice for people to stay up all night.
A bit like Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Faith actually has a very positive role to play in making a society very humane.
To love others.
And make them feel welcome.
Let's actually rebuild something better.
I wanted peace in my heart, and I was in peace, and the result of peace was that, I forgave.
I really enjoyed learning about Ramadan, and I'm really, really looking forward to hopefully next year.
Who are we?
The great work that you do.
The sort of approach that Affinity itself has taken. One in which you seek to have a broader understanding of what you believe.
Consequences for our actions.
Actually create.
There's no going back.
There are no barriers between science and faith. They complement one another.
Breaking the ice and building confidence has been really productive.
Believe in different things, you can have a different culture, different skin color, but sports bring people together.
I'm just extending my hand to the Australian Muslim community and demonstrating that we are the same.
This particular conversation about during Ramadan is one that is really, really important.
COVID-19 is an opportunity.
Which I think Affinity and other dialogue centres in our nation have really contributed to.
To find what common values we have, goals, and so it just strengthens us.
The interfaith.
Our culture is based on love and respect.
Which maybe will open the door and create some trust and build a bridge where we can start to talk about the ways that we're different from each other.
Through fasting, we are trying to empathize other people who cannot find what to eat at other times of the year. Empathy.
This is the last of our Ramadan Conversations for 2020. I look forward to catching up again soon. Ramadan Mubarak.
Well, that was just fantastic. You can watch all of those episodes on Affinity's YouTube page. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's facilitator, Pauline Wright. And I've known Pauline for 30 years. Pauline is now President of the Law Council of Australia. She's a partner and principal at PJ Donnellan & Co. Solicitors on the New South Wales Central Coast, is an accredited specialist in environmental and planning and development law. She was president of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties last year, and only the second woman to be elected to that role, and was president of the Law Society of New South Wales in 2017 after serving on the council for many, many years, where she served as the long-term chair of the Environmental Planning and Development and Criminal Law Committees. Pauline has a very long CV. She was president of the Urban Development Institute of Australia, Central Coast Chapter, from 2010 to 2016. She was appointed as a director of the Law Council of Australia in 2016, having sat on a number of key committees, including national criminal law, access to justice, equal opportunity in the law. She's a past vice president of New South Wales Women Lawyers and executive member of New South Wales Young Lawyers, which is where I met her. Pauline is a former board member of Legal Aid New South Wales and continues to serve on Legal Aid's human rights and monitoring committees. Welcome, Pauline.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's great to see you. 30 years, that's a bit terrifying. Anyway, we're still young lawyers, Stephen. But I won't delay with more chat. But it's my real pleasure to be here tonight in conversation with Elaine Pearson, because Elaine is a really impressive human being. Elaine's the Australian Director of Human Rights Watch and works to influence Australian foreign and domestic policies and give them a human rights dimension. From 2007 to 2012, she was the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division in New York. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, Elaine worked for the United Nations and various non-governmental organisations in Bangkok, Hong Kong, Kathmandu and London. She's an expert on migration and human trafficking issues and sits on the board of the Global Alliance Against Traffic in Women. She's an adjunct lecturer in law at the University of New South Wales and holds degrees in law and the arts from Australia's Murdoch University and obtained her master's degree in public policy at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. So I think we're going to have a really good conversation with Elaine tonight. Now, before we start though, I'd like to let our audience know that if they want to have some questions answered at the end, we've got some time for Q&A. Please write those questions down in the chat box and we'll try to answer them in terms of key themes that arise from the questions that we do receive in the allocated Q&A session at the end. So please do that. So, Elaine, I'll talk first a little bit about China, if I may. China's top legislative body has today passed a sweeping new national security law to be implemented in Hong Kong as early as tomorrow. It bypassed the Hong Kong Legislative Council. There was no public consultation on its terms, and it's going to include really sweeping laws that affect people's right to communicate and to do a lot of activities that Hong Kongers have held really dear to them. What's your response to that law, Elaine?
Yeah, I mean, we're really devastated actually looking at what's happening in Hong Kong right now. I think that, you know, the situation has been looking pretty grim for some time, but, you know, this is a prime example of the Chinese government really using the pretext of COVID, the fact that many governments are so busy grappling with the extent of the pandemic in their own countries, that, you know, really this is an opportunity, I guess, in some ways for the Chinese government to ram through things that it has wanted to do for a long time. And, you know, as far as Hong Kong is concerned, you know, this is absolutely a complete abrogation of the basic law of Hong Kong. And I think now's really the time for governments to stand up to the Chinese government and say this is completely unacceptable. We're very concerned about the broad and vague nature of the provisions in the national security law. In fact, we don't even really know exactly what is in that law because it's been secret. But we know that it, you know, in many ways it has spelled, you know, the death knell for democracy in Hong Kong. And I think it's been particularly sad to see that the young leaders of the Hong Kong democracy movement, people like Joshua Wong, have had to resign and basically disassemble their political parties because, they're very scared about how this law will be implemented.
It's a really alarming thing. It's going to really stifle any kind of debate in Hong Kong that might be seen to be questioning China or its authority in Hong Kong. So it's really quite alarming. Ahead of that law, a joint statement released by independent experts of the United Nations last Friday was truly unprecedented, both in terms of its breadth, touching on issues ranging from the proposed Hong Kong national security laws that are now in, to repression of ethnic and religious minorities in Xinjiang and Tibet, and detention and intimidation of human rights defenders and lawyers, and in terms of its strength. It specifically calls for the formal establishment of an independent UN mechanism to inquire into and report on the human rights situation in China. Elaine, how can the international community, as the statement says, act collectively and decisively to ensure China respects human rights and abides by its international obligations? What action can be taken, firstly by states and secondly by civil society organisations like yours and like the Law Council of Australia?
Well, yeah, I think, I can't stress enough how unprecedented this statement is, to have 50 UN special rapporteurs, experts, people sitting on committees to all speak up about the deterioration of human rights in China is really something. And today the Human Rights Council started its June session, its 45th session. And so I think those experts have really sort of laid down the gauntlet to member states of the UN and have said, now it's really up to you. So we would really expect concerned governments, including Australia, which, as you know, is a member of the UN Human Rights Council, that they would take actions to really help the UN set up, a special envoy or a special rapporteur, basically having an expert who can report on human rights violations, who can monitor what is going on, is a way of adding it to the Council's regular agenda. And so I think that's something very specific that states can work towards, and that's really necessary. I think the other thing that, the experts have really called for is just more coordinated action on China. And I think it's very important that this is depoliticized, that this isn't led by the US government, which, has been running its own trade war and a real war of words, with the Chinese government. But now's really a time for middle power countries like Australia to band together and to speak up. And, I think we have seen some encouraging statements, certainly from Maurice Payne. There have been some statements also by the Five Eyes countries, which is Australia, the UK, Canada, the US and New Zealand. But I think we really need to look at how democracies can sort of stand up and work together. And that's not just Western countries that are concerned about developments in China, but also countries, in Asia. I would really like to see countries like Indonesia, Malaysia also raising concern about what is happening to, more than 1 million Muslims who are being arbitrarily detained in camps in Xinjiang. Countries like Japan and Korea also raising concerns. So in terms of us, I guess, as civil society actors, I think it's also our job to get governments to understand that this is really important and to put pressure on our own governments and also some of these, maybe, unusual partners that we could work together with, countries, within ASEAN, for instance, who I think are also concerned about, the negative impacts of China's rise and the fact that we are now starting to see the Chinese government assert itself not only in terms of its horrific human rights abuses within its borders, but also these very sort of aggressive actions like the actions it's taking in Hong Kong, like the actions of foreign interference in other countries' political affairs. And so, I think this is really worrying for many countries and for many civil society actors around the world.
Thanks. Let's move on for a moment to another nation where there have been some real concerns in our region, in the Philippines. Since Duterte's election in 2016, there's been a striking escalation of human rights abuses in the Philippines, many of which have been sanctioned through the so-called war on drugs. And the war on drugs has been invoked to justify systemic violence and disproportionate force by law enforcement, the elimination of political opposition, and creating a culture of impunity. In view of the long-standing bilateral relationship between Australia and the Philippines, which is, of course, strategically very important to Australia, Australia's refrained from publicly condemning human rights violations perpetrated or sanctioned by Duterte's government. How might Australia strongly and unequivocally insist that the government of the Philippines abide by its human rights obligations under international law?
Well, look, I think Australia is concerned about what's happening in the Philippines under Duterte, but I think it's been, uncertain about whether, a strong public response will just inflame, Duterte's ire even more. He's a bit like, a Trump-like figure. He's very unpredictable. But I think this situation is very serious. We're talking about the killings of thousands of people by police, by security forces, with total impunity. And today, there will actually be at the Human Rights Council an opportunity for Australia to make a statement. There will be an interactive dialogue with the UN High Commissioner about a report on the Philippines that the High Commissioner's office just released a few weeks ago. And that report is really very clear. They're very concerned about the widespread systematic nature of these violations in the Philippines, and the fact that there has really been no accountability at all. And so I think we have to think, well, if there's no domestic accountability, and if the critics of Duterte, people like Senator De Lima, who was one of the people actually in the parliament who actually spoke up against Duterte and opposed his war on drugs, she remains in jail. I think it's now been 3 years since she was imprisoned. And then people like journalists, the outspoken journalist Maria Ressa, also convicted, and who isn't serving a sentence. But it's like, if the Philippines government is able to go after these domestic critics, then clearly the responsibility falls to international governments and places like the UN to hold the Philippine government accountable. And, that pressure will really be needed in order to stem, I guess, the flow of these killings and ensure there is some measure of accountability. So I hope that Australia will speak up. I hope that Australia would support efforts to have a proper UN Commission of Inquiry to examine these killings, and also support the fact that, right now there is the International Criminal Court has opened a preliminary investigation into those killings. And I think it's really important that member states of the court also express support for that, because Duterte's response to that was simply to withdraw the Philippines from the ICC. So, there's lots of things I think Australia can do. And again, I think it's really about working in partnership with other countries in terms of taking a stand.
And you don't think there's any value in winding back aid or imposing sanctions? Any measures of that kind?
I think aid has to go to the people that most need it. I think we would be very supportive of restricting any assistance, for instance, to law enforcement, to the police, particularly the units that are engaged in this war on drugs. And I think there absolutely should be screening of any Philippine law enforcement officials who may be coming to Australia for training. But I don't think we would support, the restriction of humanitarian aid, given that we know how important that is. I think we would also be very supportive of targeted sanctions, so limited measures that target specific human rights abusers that are responsible for these killings. But we wouldn't support broad-based sanctions against the Philippine government.
Thank you. Yes. What about West Papua? The military occupation of West Papua is another critical issue in our region, right on Australia's doorstep, and yet it's largely hidden from the headlines. In August last year, Indonesia had its own Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of demonstrations that were also sparked by racism, and now the protest leaders are in jail. What actions and leadership do you think the Australian government should be taking in relation to that?
Well, look, I think as far as West Papua is concerned, Human Rights Watch doesn't take any position on self-determination or the sovereignty of West Papua. We recognise that it is part of Indonesia. But we are very concerned that this province is treated very differently to other provinces in Indonesia. And so when you've had these protests that, went really nationwide, but were particularly concerning in Papua, the response was, really to go after the protest leaders, people who were organizing peaceful protests, and to throw them all in jail. And that's really concerning. So, we know that, right now there's more than 20 people who are imprisoned in Indonesia. What we would hope that governments like Australia would do is that they would be calling for the release of political prisoners, that anyone who's, been imprisoned for peaceful acts of free expression should not be behind bars. And I hope that the Australian government would also just hold President Jokowi of Indonesia to the things that he's promised to do, but hasn't really done. So, Jokowi promised some time ago that he would allow the UN Human Rights Office to visit Papua. That hasn't happened. He also had made, vague comments saying that he would lift the decade-old restrictions on journalists, foreign journalists, being able to visit that province. That hasn't happened. So I really think, treating this province like other parts of Indonesia, allowing human rights organizations, allowing foreign journalists to go to Papua to look at the situation on the ground is actually the best way of resolving some of these long-standing grievances of the Papuans, and also presenting a very sort of fair and clear assessment of the human rights situation on the ground. The problem is, at the moment, when stuff happens in West Papua, where there's a killing or when disturbing footage emerges, it's very difficult for human rights investigators to be able to verify that information because access is so restricted. So I think opening up access would go a long way towards addressing those issues.
And you mentioned earlier, you made a brief reference to the COVID-19 situation, and we've seen, I'd like to just expand on that a little bit. We've seen several examples of authoritarian-leaning countries in Southeast Asia using the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext to further suppress human rights, looking at curfews in the Philippines and disproportionate force used to enforce the curfews, restrictions on media freedoms in Cambodia, Thailand, as well as the Philippines, to control fake news, apparently. How can we use bilateral diplomacy, wield regional influence in Australia to control or condemn these sorts of actions? And what other human rights issues are emerging in this context?
Well, yeah, I think it was interesting that Marise Payne gave a speech, I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago, where actually she raised this very issue. And she said that she was concerned about how governments are basically using the excuse of COVID to sort of ram through very repressive measures, and how that was of concern to the Australian government. So I think, really what we'd like to see more is, I guess, a consistent principled position wherever this stuff occurs. So, not just raising it when it comes to China, which obviously, also has engaged in mass censorship and throwing people in jail simply for raising the alarm or presenting, independent information about what was happening during the pandemic. But also looking at, in countries like Cambodia, where Hun Sen has introduced, the Hun Sen government has introduced a very broad state of emergency decree that basically gives the government unlimited and unchecked powers. This is really concerning. And so, I think during times of a public health crisis like, this pandemic, of course, governments, do have the ability to take certain extreme measures to, contain the pandemic. But it's very important that those measures are lawful, that they are time-bound, that they are specific, and that also they don't, occur in a way that is, or they don't have effects that are arbitrary or discriminatory. And, certainly I think the other thing that we've noticed with the COVID provisions that have been brought in by some countries is that there are certain groups of people who are especially vulnerable, whether it might be, people with disabilities, people in aged care facilities, prisoners, who, because of the situation that they're in, living in closed settings, they are more vulnerable to this pandemic. So part of the work that we've been doing is really to draw attention to these trends in different countries, and also put a bit of pressure on governments to monitor what's going on and to ensure that they introduce, really a rights-respecting response So quite early on, we put out a checklist where we basically said, here are the human rights concerns, here are the things that we're worried about in terms of the COVID pandemic, and here are some ways to respond that don't involve the violation of human rights.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Obviously, Australia has a role now on the Human Rights Council for the 2018 to 2020 term. This was the first time Australia has been a member of this 47-member body and wielded voting rights with respect to Human Rights Council resolutions. As Australia comes towards the end of its 3-year term, I'd be interested to hear your views about Australia's performance on the Human Rights Council.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, generally, Australia has done a good job. I do think, we have such a mixed bag of countries on the Human Rights Council. So it's this body in Geneva, 47 governments. They're broken down into different groups. So Australia is part of the Western Europe and other group. But some of the other groups have really selected pretty rights-abusing governments to join the Human Rights Council. So, we've seen the likes of Saudi Arabia, China, neither of them on at the moment, but they're likely to come on the end of this year, Venezuela, Cuba. So it's actually really important that the other governments, the ones from, either Western countries or countries that are democracies, really do the heavy lifting to ensure that where there is systematic and gross violations of human rights, that they will be prepared to lead on resolutions and to vote the right way. And I would say Australia generally votes the right way on resolutions, with a few exceptions, but it hasn't often done that heavy lifting to ensure that countries that are committing gross abuses get on the Council's attention. And so we'd like to see that a bit more. We did see really encouraging leadership from Australia last year in terms of Australia leading on the second ever joint statement on Saudi Arabia, which followed obviously the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and also the continuing detention of women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia. So I think that was really great that Australia led on that situation, but I hope that they would continue to show leadership on other countries of concern, situations like what we've just been talking about, the Philippines, China, countries that, really do need to have continued scrutiny. It can be very difficult and challenging to find countries that are prepared to lead on country situations, precisely because they often get blowback from those governments because they're trying to sort of hide the scrutiny of their violations.
Are there other multilateral forums that Australia might become involved with now that our role on the Council is coming to an end?
I mean, there's other ones. I mean, the G20, I guess, will be coming up later this year. Australia's a member there. And it's interesting that Saudi Arabia actually is hosting the G20 this year. I think it's very unlikely that it will be an in-person event. But when it was looking like it would be, they were actually planning to hold that event in the same Ritz-Carlton hotel that was used to arbitrarily detain hundreds of people just a few years ago. So, certainly I think using opportunities like the G20 to raise human rights issues and to make sure that it's not just, a political forum or an opportunity, for countries to sort of, deal with economic issues. I think that's really the challenge for Australia, is to use those existing forums quite well. Australia's already sat on the Security Council and again did a pretty good job there actually in terms of ensuring issues like North Korea and the human rights situation there were, taken into consideration by the UN Security Council. But I really think it's about, really, I guess, more informal ways of working with other middle powers. Like that's actually going to be the key to managing tricky situations like China or other human rights abuses around the world, is having coalitions of governments work together. And we saw this happen quite effectively with regards to Myanmar and the Rohingya situation, where the OIC, the Organisation for Islamic Cooperation, partnered with the EU to lead on a resolution about what was happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar. And that was really, quite incredible and unprecedented. And I'd really like to see Australia sort of lead and spearhead, maybe some of those more unlikely and unusual allies and partnerships, and it will depend really on specific countries who those partners and allies will be.
Can we start looking at our bilateral ties? We've obviously got strong bilateral ties in the Asia-Pacific region. So when human rights violations are brought to our attention, how should the Australian government shift its foreign policy approach to insist that, for a start, our bilateral partners respect the rule of law and human rights and press for accountability?
Well, I mean, I would like to see human rights there as a key pillar of foreign policy alongside trade, alongside security. And I think sometimes it is there, but not always. And I think that inconsistency is a bit of a problem. So I guess I would like to see, the foreign minister certainly speaking up consistently on issues that happen around the world, but not just the foreign minister. I think it's really important that ambassadors, politicians who are visiting countries, on a mission, find opportunities to, raise human rights issues. And this isn't about Australia lecturing other countries. I don't think that, at all would be useful, but it's really about finding opportunities to stand with people of those countries who are having their human rights abused and, where those countries are not following international law. And so it's about finding opportunities like Hong Kong, meeting with the protest leaders, talking to them, giving them a bit more visibility, giving them a little bit more security. And I would love to see that happen a bit more broadly. I think in some countries it does happen. If you have an ambassador who's particularly concerned about human rights issues, they will do that a bit more. They will meet with civil society groups. They'll get photos taken and, they will report on, trials of civil society activists who may, be facing problems in those countries. But it doesn't always happen. And so I think it's really about ensuring that the promotion and protection of human rights is really a key pillar of Australia's foreign policy.
Sometimes it feels like our particular trade relationships and reliance on certain nations for trade, it has an effect on our condemnation of their human rights violations. How can we be consistent in our condemnation of comparable human rights violations?
Well, that's right. And I mean, I think one thing that Australia could do is when it's negotiating a free trade agreement with a foreign government, it should have a provision in there about human rights and the protection of human rights. And this is something that the EU already does in all its free trade agreements. So it's certainly something that Australia could do. But at the moment, those negotiations only take place between trade negotiators, and there's very little mention of human rights, despite the fact that, things like labour issues are actually intrinsically linked to, those trade preferential treatment that those governments receive, as a benefit of signing a free trade agreement. So I think that's something concretely that they could do. And then it would also mean that those trade negotiators need to look into human rights issues. And, I would actually like to see more reporting, formal reporting from DFAT, maybe the presentation of annual reports on human rights for countries with which it has a trading relationship. And then at least that would sort of lay out benchmarks and make countries aware that, Australia is a government that is really concerned about these issues and that it is going to monitor progress. It would be an opportunity to commend governments if they take positive steps, if they, remove repressive laws, if they free, for instance, trade unionists who are in jail. But it would also provide an opportunity to hold governments to account and to call them out where they introduce bad laws or where they are engaged in the repression of rights. And so I think that's, something that the Australian government could do when it comes to trade negotiations.
Australia has, of course, on occasions called out egregious incursions into human rights under the pretext of counterterrorism and national security laws in the past, as a pretext really to suppress political opposition and deter human rights lawyers and others from undertaking their work. So Australia's called that out, mentioning China, Turkey, the Philippines, and Australia has properly called that out. But Australia's policies with respect to refugees and asylum seekers are constantly interpreted overseas to violate Australia's obligations under international law. Elaine, do you think that these domestic policies damage Australia's foreign policy or erode Australia's standing as regional defenders of human rights and the rule of law?
Oh, definitely. I definitely think it erodes, Australia's standing. The awful, horrific treatment of asylum seekers and refugees in this country, and also, our own record on national security here, is problematic. I mean, just look at the fact that Australia, hasn't really lifted a finger to help, all of these Australians who are trapped in northeastern Syria at the moment, who are, children and wives of ISIS suspects, but who've basically been dumped, in a camp in the middle of the desert and who can't get home. The government's put so much energy and is so proud of its efforts to return, tens of thousands of Australian citizens. And yet for some Australians, it seems like they can't even access that very basic consular assistance. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely something that the Australian government should be doing. And I think, yes, we need to call out Australia's human rights abuses just as much as, Australia is condemning human rights abuses in other places. And ultimately, Australia will be a more credible voice on human rights if it is seen to be acting to address the issues here in Australia. And so I think that is very important. But certainly no country has a perfect human rights record. And so, if the precursor to condemning human rights abuses somewhere else was that, we had to have a perfect record, then no one would ever condemn anything. So I think it's about, addressing the issues domestically, but also being, unafraid to call things out when they reach a certain level in other countries.
And I just wanted to quickly touch on targeted sanctions, the Magnitsky legislation that Australia is looking at the moment. So I suppose, one of the key themes of tonight's discussion is around what more can Australia do to advance human rights across the region. So what role do targeted sanctions have in calling out egregious behaviour by individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually quite excited about this inquiry that's underway at the moment. I know the Law Council's also been a part of it. Human Rights Watch has testified before this committee. And so targeted sanctions, just for people who aren't really that familiar with it, this is about having travel bans and asset freezes against individuals that are have committed either acts of gross corruption or acts of human rights abuse. And so it can be a very effective way of not punishing an entire government, but basically pinpointing exactly who is committing the human rights abuses and saying, you're not going to be welcome in Australia. And I think that could be particularly powerful here because, I certainly know that there are abusive government officials of certain, Southeast Asian neighbouring countries who like to travel to Australia because, maybe their children go to school here, maybe they have property here, maybe they just like to come shopping here. And so if you could seize those assets or if you could prevent them from travelling, even if they've evaded, accountability for extrajudicial killings in their home country, it means that there would at least be some measure of accountability in Australia. And it would basically put pressure on those governments to address those abusive officials. So I think it's something that the US government has done through the Magnitsky Act. The EU also has, a framework now for targeted sanctions for human rights abuses. The UK has it. I think it'd be really great if Australia could come on board and do this. Australia does have, at the moment, an autonomous sanctions act, but it's very broad and vague, and it's very unclear exactly how those decisions are made. So this would mean basically that human rights would be a specific criteria for imposing those sanctions, which would be incredibly useful.
Yeah, I think for the Law Council, the priority is that the regime would have to be necessary, reasonable and proportionate and strike that appropriate balance between capturing human rights abusers while ensuring at the same time that the executive power to impose sanctions has safeguards to ensure that we're not capturing people who are perhaps unfairly being accused. So, and I know that Human Rights Watch has a similar view, so we're also excited about it. But look, we've just had a few questions coming through on the Q&A line, because it's time to start looking at those. One of them you've already really responded to. That was from Geneva, but we've really responded to that. That's about Australia's own human rights record being under scrutiny. But another related one is, given a lack of political leadership and credibility on human rights in Australia and abroad, how can Australian civil society do more to work with and support human rights activists in our region?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I mean, I think, the Australian government gets away with not doing much on human rights internationally because there isn't enough reporting and scrutiny of, what is going on. I think part of that's also, as we've seen, cuts to the media. We're seeing less coverage of human rights abuses, probably less coverage of what's going on in terms of foreign affairs in Australia's foreign policy. And even, particular places like the UN in New York or Geneva is maybe getting less attention. So, I certainly think that, there are things that Australians can do to show solidarity with, people in Asian countries whose rights are being abused. And that is really about presenting information, talking to your local MP or politician, asking them what they're doing to raise these issues. And particularly, Australia is such a multicultural country. We work with many diaspora groups in raising these concerns who regularly come to Human Rights Watch, concerned about what is happening in other countries. And I think, trying to sort of work with civil society organisations to make the government know that Australians really care about foreign policy is really important. Because if that doesn't happen, then it's very easy for our MPs simply to say, well, yes, that's a very, interesting issue, but actually we're more concerned about issues here in Australia and we're not going to raise these foreign policy issues. So I think it's really about all of us working together on those issues. And I think if people want to get more information, we have Human Rights Watch has a Facebook page where we're regularly updating information about our work here in Australia, but also what's happening in the region. And we also have our website where we, put out, materials on many different countries around the world. About what is the human rights situation in those countries and what we would like concerned governments like the Australian government to do.
Another question that's come through is whether Human Rights Watch is taking a position on the prohibitions of public assemblies to support the Black Lives Matter movement and draw attention to Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia.
I don't think we haven't taken a formal position, but certainly, I've made comments on social media and I think to some journalists that, people have the right to protest. And, as far as Black Lives Matter is concerned, this is a really important moment, not just for people who've experienced racism in the United States, but certainly our Aboriginal population here. And I think it's very important and, encouraging that so many people have turned out to those protests in order to raise concerns about what the government is doing to address those issues. Human Rights Watch is currently doing a bit of work around deaths in custody related to disability, and it's really disappointing to see, recommendations churned out again and again in coroner's reports that are just not being implemented in any way in our prison system. So, I think the way in which we're going to get real traction on these issues is, yes, by getting people's attention. And, certainly I know there were a lot of concerns during coronavirus. Is, the protests going to cause, some concerns for public health? But, our message was really, if, it's up to people's individual decision to turn up. But obviously, if they can find ways to socially distance, to wear masks, that's extremely important, given the risks of COVID right now for the community.
Another question that came through was in relation to your recently appointed first Australian Human Rights Watch researcher, Sophie McNeil. We note that you've appointed Sophie McNeil, the ABC journalist from Four Corners. as your first Australian researcher. What are the human rights issues in Australia that you expect Sophie to focus on?
Well, I think we've got a long list of topics for her to work through. We haven't yet decided what's going to be the top of those, and I think it will also depend a bit on travel restrictions and what she's able to do. But, certainly I think paying more attention to abuses against refugees and asylum seekers in Australia and also offshore. This is an area where Human Rights Watch has already done quite a bit of work, but I think having Sophie on board, will be really tremendous way of, really enhancing that work, looking at abuses against migrant workers, looking at some of the impacts of national security legislation, particularly on lawyers, on whistleblowers, and the damaging effects that really has for our democracy and civil society, are all things that, we would like her to look at. As well as, looking at the criminal justice system, and particularly, the disproportionate number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prisons. We've started doing a bit of work, already in this area, but, I think Sophie would be, a really wonderful person to really dig a bit deeper into some of those issues and try and, get a bit of impact from our governments to pay more attention and to address these human rights violations. So I'm absolutely thrilled that she's coming on board, and yes, there's going to be a lot of things for her to work on.
Perhaps given her background in East Timor and knowledge, I think, of West Papua, perhaps she may have some assistance to play there too.
Yeah, she'll be looking at issues in Australia primarily, but, potentially, yes, if there's issues around, human rights abuses here linked to, actions in East Timor, then, certainly that would be something that we would consider. I think also, we've done a bit of work around, Chinese government interference, particularly on university campuses. That's actually something that, continues to be reported. Obviously the universities, are facing a lot of pressure right now and aren't having so many international students. But I think now is also a really important time that universities look at that dependence on other governments. And if that has come at the cost of, basically, being silent about human rights abuses, then I think that's really concerning.
Right. And a final question from our audience. Turkey has had a very poor human rights record since the July 2016 so-called coup attempt, and Turkey hosts the Anzac Day ceremonies. What do you think our government's response to this should be?
Yeah, Human Rights Watch has long been critical about, a whole litany of human rights abuses that have occurred under the Erdogan government, but particularly back down on civil society and government critics. And absolutely, I think Australia should be finding opportunities to raise those issues with the Turkish government, particularly given the EU in many ways has been unwilling to raise a lot of these issues with Turkey because of the whole refugee issue and, the proximity of the EU to Turkey, and I guess the concerns about flows of migrants. So actually, I think Turkey would be a really good one for Australia to, ensure that it is held accountable, and using forums like the Human Rights Council is actually, that's what it's there for. It is there to raise, gross, systemic, widespread human rights violations, particularly where they're not being addressed in their home countries. So yeah, absolutely would be keen for Australia to do more there.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, look, it's time for us to wrap up now, Elaine. Thank you so much. It's been such a fascinating discussion. And I'm sure everybody who's listening tonight has been thrilled to have you here. So thank you very, very much. But to end the night, I'd like to call upon Affinity's own Executive Director, Ahmet Polat, to present the concluding remarks for the program tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline.
Thank you, my cousin Pauline.
Thank you very much, Ahmet. I think we've lost you for a moment there.
Yep. Good evening, everyone, and my newly extended families, aunties, cousins, uncles. Thank you for virtually joining tonight Affinity's webinar series with the Human Rights Watch in Australia. I'm delighted to co-host this event with peace-loving people tonight. Indeed, I would have liked to host the program at Affinity's office and interact with our speakers and each and every one of our online viewers, yet we are unable to do due to COVID. What a wonderful conversation with two spectacular experts. First and foremost, I would like to sincerely thank our co-host, my esteemed friend Elaine Pearson, the Australia Director at Human Rights Watch, with this insightful and segment, as well as your valuable colleague, Nicole. It's an honor to be in partnership with Human Rights Watch. Tonight's conversation was insightful contribution to the human rights crisis in the Australian and Asian society. I would also like to sincerely thank my esteemed cousin Pauline, the President of the Law Council of Australia, for not only facilitating today's panel, but for the great work Pauline has been leading and doing in assisting our dynamic multicultural Australian society regarding human rights. I would also like to thank Pauline's colleague Charlotte for assisting the organization of. Finally, I would like to sincerely thank my cousin Steve, a valuable advisor, both member of Affinity Intercultural Foundation, for his time tonight and the warm welcoming of the program. I think our collaboration tonight stands as proof of the human rights and the rule of law of respect, understanding, and peace towards making Australia and the world a better place, where the community grows within justice and harmony. In a single word, affinity can be defined as a bridge. It is intended to be a bridge between human rights and human dignity among democracy and pluralism. In my view, the pillars of affinity's bridges are love, mercy, acceptance, mutual respect, human rights, and justice. Human rights have been a lifelong struggle. However, as a global community, it is within our hands to live in a civic, democratic, multicultural society. Permanent solutions to our global community can only be attained through long-term education programs and socio-cultural measures alongside legal reforms. As renowned American labor organizer, for human rights and laws, many people have their lives over the years and suffered enormously to help make the world a better place for its people. Here, I'd like to pay tribute to the advocates and activists of the human rights who devoted their life and legacy: Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. King, and many other valuable activists. As we remember the lessons and wisdom of these prominent scholars, we must reaffirm our commitment to the dignity of all humans and to our shared values of peace, human rights, mutual understanding, and respect through open dialogue. Finally, thank you our listeners from home and our distinguished speakers, Pauline, Elaine, Steve, and supporters. Tonight's episodes will be added to webinar series on Affinity's YouTube page, so you are more than welcome to come back at any time and watch the video or share it with friends, family. I look forward to Affinity's program. Have a lovely evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.